That Cursed Human. Part 2. The Curse They Talk About. Greyhaven was the kind of planet that made you wonder why anyone would choose to live there. It was cold and rocky, with thin gray skies and winds that cut through clothing like a knife through paper. The soil was poor. The seasons were harsh. The nearest friendly port was 2 days away at full burn. But humans had a strange habit of planting themselves in the worst places and refusing to leave. And Greyhaven had been home to 3,000 colonists for 20 years. Danny brought the rust bucket down through the atmosphere with a rattling descent that made Lyra grip her seat with white knuckles. The ship landed on a cracked concrete pad outside the main settlement, a collection of low, sturdy buildings carved into the walls of a deep canyon system. Everything on Greyhaven was built into the rock. The colonists had learned early that anything left on the surface would be torn apart by the wind. Governor Pete Callahan met them at the landing pad. He was a thin man in his late 50s, with gray hair and tired eyes, and the look of someone who had been carrying a heavy weight for too long. He wore a patched coat and boots that had been repaired more times than they had been cleaned. "Danny Kowalski," Callahan said, shaking his hand without enthusiasm. "I heard you got kicked out of the fleet." "News travels. Bad news always does." Callahan looked at Lyra, then at the data chip she held out to him. "What's this?" Danny told him everything. The Korath warships at Horizon's Edge, the secret deal with High Coordinator Salus, the sensor network access that would give the Dominion surveillance over half the galaxy. Callahan listened in silence, his face getting older with every sentence. When Danny finished, Callahan handed the data chip back. "And what exactly do you want me to do about it?" the governor asked. "Help us get the word out. Broadcast it to the Galactic Council, to every species with a communication array." Callahan shook his head slowly. "The last time a human tried to play hero, the Korath burned 3 colonies in retaliation. 3 colonies, Danny. 12,000 people. You want to know what the galaxy said? They said the humans provoked it. They always say we provoked it. So we do nothing? We survive. That's what we do here. We survive." Callahan turned and walked back toward the settlement. "You can stay long enough to refuel. Then, I want you gone." Danny stood on the landing pad, with the wind pulling at his jacket, and watched the governor disappear into the canyon. He felt Lyra step up beside him. "He's scared," she said. "He's right to be scared, but scared doesn't fix anything." A voice came from behind them. "Neither does being brave, young man, but it does make for better stories." They turned to find an older woman leaning on a metal cane at the edge of the pad. She was in her early 60s, small and lean, with sharp gray eyes and white hair pulled back tight. She wore a plain civilian coat, but something about the way she stood, the way she watched them, said military. "Nora Sharp," she said. "Retired. Earthfleet intelligence, 30 years. Now I grow vegetables in bad soil and mind my own business." She smiled, most days. Danny had heard the name. Nora Sharp had been one of the architects of humanity's first diplomatic missions to alien species. She had helped write the treaties that gave humans a seat at the galactic table. And then she had disappeared from public life without explanation. "I heard your conversation with the governor," Nora said. "Walk with me." She led them through the canyon settlement to her small home, a single room cut into the rock, with a desk covered in old data pads, and a window that looked out on nothing but gray stone. She took the data chip, plugged it into her desk terminal, and spent 10 minutes reading in silence. "It's real," she said finally, "and it's worse than you think. This isn't just an expansion. The Korath are positioning for a full sweep of the neutral territories. If they get access to the Horizon's Edge sensor network, they'll see every fleet movement, every supply line, every defensive gap in 12 systems. Then we have to warn people," Lyra said. Nora leaned back in her chair and looked at them both with those sharp eyes. Let me tell you something first. Let me tell you why the galaxy calls us cursed. She told them about the Velhari border war 40 years ago. A Velhari fleet had moved to bombard a colony world of a smaller species called the Reni. The Galactic Council debated for weeks. No one acted. Then a human freighter captain named Jack Dunn flew his ship directly into the engine core of the Velhari flagship. The explosion stopped the bombardment and saved 4 million Reni lives. But the blast was so powerful, it destabilized the planet's orbital mechanics. For the next 30 years, the Reni homeworld suffered earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and climate shifts that killed hundreds of thousands. The galaxy didn't remember the Velhari bombardment that was stopped. They remembered the human who caused the catastrophe that followed. She told them about the Kessler incident, 22 years ago. A Dramari weapons program was developing a device that could collapse hyperspace lanes, cutting off entire species from faster-than-light travel. A human intelligence officer named Carla Morrow infiltrated the program and destroyed the prototype. The resulting explosion took out half a Dramari research station and killed 200 scientists. The galaxy didn't remember the weapon that would have isolated billions. They remembered the human who killed 200 people. She told them 6 stories like this. Every one followed the same pattern. Humans saw a threat. Humans warned others. Others did nothing. Humans acted anyway. The threat was stopped. The damage was enormous, and the galaxy blamed the humans. That's the curse, Nora said. We can't look away. Every other species in the galaxy has learned to look away when something terrible is happening, if the cost of stopping it is too high. They calculate. They weigh lives against lives and systems against systems, and they decide that doing nothing is the rational choice. Humans can't do that. Something in us breaks when we try. Danny sat in silence for a long moment. So what do? We need allies before we broadcast anything. If we just throw this data into the open, the Council will dismiss it as human paranoia. We need someone with weight behind them. Nora pulled up a star chart on her terminal. The Thalwyn. The Thalwyn don't get involved in anything, Lyra said. They never have. But they hold 3 seats on the Galactic Council, and their word carries more weight than any other species. If we can convince even one Thalwyn elder that this is real, the Council will have to listen. And if we can't convince them? Danny asked. Nora looked at him with an expression that was not quite a smile. Then we do what humans always do. We act anyway and deal with the consequences. The conversation was interrupted by a sharp alarm that echoed through the canyon. Danny ran to the window. High above, cutting through Greyhaven's gray clouds, he could see the bright streaks of ships entering the atmosphere. They were not friendly ships. Callahan's voice crackled over the colony's communication system. All residents to the deep shelters. This is not a drill. We have incoming hostile vessels. Repeat, all residents to the deep shelters. Danny turned to Nora. The Korath found us. Nora was already on her feet, moving faster than her age and her cane should have allowed. They tracked your ship. I would have been surprised if they hadn't. She grabbed a bag from under her desk and slung it over her shoulder. I'll reach the Thalwyn. You two keep these people alive, long enough for it to matter. Lyra looked at Danny. This colony has almost no defenses. Danny looked out the window at the ships descending through the clouds, dark shapes growing larger against the gray sky. He thought about Callahan's words. The last time a human tried to play hero, 3 colonies burned. He thought about the 3,000 people in this canyon who had spent 20 years surviving on a planet that didn't want them, and who were now about to face an enemy they never asked for. Then we build some, he said. That Cursed Human, Part 3. What Humans Do When Cornered. The Korath strike team hit Greyhaven, expecting to find frightened colonists huddled in caves, waiting to surrender. What they found instead was something they were not prepared for. Meg Hewitt had been a mining engineer on Greyhaven for 16 years. She was a broad woman in her 40s, with thick arms and calloused hands that looked like it had been carved from the same stone she spent her life cutting. When the alarm sounded, she didn't run to the shelters. She ran to the mining depot. Within 30 minutes, she had organized 60 colonists into defensive teams. They had industrial cutting lasers, seismic charges meant for breaking rock, heavy drilling machines that could be mounted on canyon ledges, and 20 years of knowledge about every tunnel, crack, and blind corner in the canyon system. "We know this ground," Meg told the gathered colonists, her voice steady and loud enough to echo off the canyon walls. "They don't. That's our advantage. Use it." Danny found Meg at the depot, and for a moment just stood there watching her work. She moved with a calm efficiency that reminded him of the best officers he had served under in the fleet. The ones who didn't waste time on speeches when action would do. "I need your ship in the air," Meg told him, without looking up from the detonator she was wiring. "What for?" "Air support. You've got a cargo crane on that freighter. We've got 2 tons of mining charges in Storage Bay 4. You fly over them and drop rocks on their heads." "That's your plan? You got a better one?" He didn't. Lyra set up her field hospital in the deepest section of the cave network. A wide natural chamber with a low ceiling and the sound of water dripping somewhere in the dark. She laid out her instruments on a flat rock and arranged her medical supplies with the practiced speed of someone who had done this too many times before. 3 colonists with basic first aid training volunteered to help her. She showed them what to do and tried not to think about what was coming. The Korath landed 4 transport ships on the plateau above the canyon. 200 soldiers in black armor marched in precise formation toward the canyon entrances. Their commander, a tall officer with the Dominion's red insignia on his chest, sent a short-range broadcast to the colony. "Surrender the data chip and the humans who stole it. You have 1 hour. After that, we will take what we came for." Nobody answered. The first Korath squad entered the North Canyon Passage and made it about 200 meters before Meg's people collapsed the ceiling on them. The explosion shook the ground and sent a column of dust shooting out of the canyon mouth like smoke from a chimney. 8 Korath soldiers were buried under 10,000 tons of rock. After that, the Korath stopped being careful and started being angry. They split into smaller groups and pushed into the canyon from 3 different entrances. The fighting was close and ugly. Colonists fired cutting lasers from behind rock formations, and the bright beams left glowing orange lines on the canyon walls. Korath soldiers returned fire with pulse rifles that blew chunks of stone into the air with each shot. The sound was deafening, a constant roar of weapons fire and falling rock that echoed through the canyons until it felt like the whole planet was shaking. Hank Russo was 22 years old. He had been born on Greyhaven and had never left. He had joined the colony militia because it seemed like the right thing to do, and because his mother had told him that someone had to stand up for the people who couldn't stand up for themselves. He had never fired a weapon at a living thing in his life. When the Korath came around the corner of Tunnel 7, Hank froze. His hands locked on his cutting laser, and his legs stopped working, and his mind went completely blank. The Korath soldier raised his rifle, and Hank just stood there, a boy in a borrowed jacket holding a mining tool, about to die in a hole in the ground on a planet nobody cared about. Meg hit him from the side like a freight train, throwing both of them behind a rock outcropping as pulse fires scorched the air where Hank had been standing. She landed on top of him, then rolled off and fired her own laser at the Korath, driving them back. "Get up," she said. "I can't. I froze. I just stood there and I couldn't move," Hank said. Meg grabbed his jacket and pulled his face close to hers. "Being afraid is normal. Quitting is not. Those people in the caves, the kids and the old folks are the ones who can't fight. They're counting on us. So you get up You pick up your weapon, and you do your job. You can fall apart later. Right now, you fight. Hank got up. He picked up his weapon. He fought. Above the canyon, Danny flew the rust bucket in low circles, dropping mining charges on Korath positions. The freighter was never meant for combat. It shook and groaned with every turn, and warning lights flashed across the cockpit like a festival. But Danny flew it the way he flew everything. Too fast, too low, and with a kind of reckless precision that made the Korath ground forces scatter every time his shadow passed over them. He made 9 runs before the Korath brought up their anti-air weapons. On the 10th run, a pulse blast tore through the rust bucket's left cargo bay and sent the ship spinning. Danny fought the controls, swearing loudly, and managed to level out just long enough to aim the nose at the Korath's main transport ship sitting on the plateau. He didn't ram it head-on. He brought the rust bucket down at an angle and used the ship's heavy cargo crane like a battering ram, smashing it into the transport's landing gear at full speed. The impact was massive. Metal screamed, and sparks flew in every direction. The transport tipped sideways and crashed onto its hull, its engines dead. The rust bucket slid across the plateau and came to a stop with half its systems offline and smoke pouring from a dozen places. Danny sat in the pilot's seat, bleeding from a cut on his forehead and breathing hard. The ship's computer helpfully informed him that the cargo bay was destroyed, the left engine was on fire, and the structural integrity was at 14%. Yeah, Danny said to no one. I noticed. The Korath ground forces were now stranded. Their main transport was wrecked, and the 3 remaining ships didn't have enough capacity to evacuate everyone. The fighting in the canyons slowed as the Korath realized their situation had changed. But the victory was not clean. 12 colonists were wounded. 3 were dead. Lyra worked in the field hospital with blood on her hands and sweat on her face, stitching wounds and setting bones and speaking in a calm, steady voice that held people together when their bodies were falling apart. Hank brought in a man named Greg, who had taken a pulse blast to the shoulder. Lyra cut away the burned clothing and went to work. Hank stood there watching, his hands still shaking, and Lyra looked up at him just once. You're still standing, she said. That matters. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to him all day. Then the ground shook, not from an explosion in the canyons, from above, from orbit. Danny had dragged himself out of the wrecked rust bucket and was standing on the plateau, looking up at the sky through the thin gray clouds. He could see lights up there, bright and getting brighter, the unmistakable glow of ship-mounted weapons charging. Commander Zale's flagship hung in orbit above Greyhaven. Inside the bridge, Zale stood with his hands behind his back, his pale face calm and his black eyes reflecting the tactical display. His officers had reported the situation on the ground. The strike team was stranded. The humans were fighting back. Zale was not surprised. Humans always fought back. It was the most predictable and the most irritating thing about them. Begin orbital bombardment, he said. Target the canyon surface structures and entrances. Bury them. One of his officers hesitated. Commander, there are civilians in those caves. If the Galactic Council learns we bombarded a colony, they will blame the humans for provoking us, Zale said. They always do. The first shots came down like falling stars, bright lines of white fire that struck the canyon rim and turned rock into lava. The ground heaved and buckled. Canyon entrances collapsed in avalanches of stone and dust. The sound was like the world ending, a deep, rolling thunder that went on and on. Danny stood in the open as debris rained around him, looking up at the fire coming down from the sky. Lyra ran to him and grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the one remaining tunnel entrance that hadn't collapsed yet. Move, she shouted over the roar. They ran together into the darkness as the world above them burned. The last thing Danny saw, before the tunnel entrance collapsed behind them, was the sky lit up with fire, and the dark shapes of Korath warships hanging above the clouds like gods passing judgment on a species that refused to kneel. That Cursed Human, Part 4. The Galaxy Watches. The caves were dark, and the air was thick with dust, and the sound of people trying not to panic. Meg Hewitt had moved everyone deeper into the cave network 3 hours before the bombardment started. She had looked at the tactical situation, done the math in her head, and decided that the Korath on the ground were a distraction. The real danger was always going to come from orbit. She told Callahan, and the governor, to his credit, didn't argue. He gave the evacuation order, and the colonists moved into the deep tunnels like they had practiced in drills 100 times before. 3,000 people sat in the dark, listening to the world above them shake itself apart. The bombardment lasted 40 minutes. Jael was precise. He didn't want to destroy the planet. He wanted to seal the caves and let nature do the rest. Without air circulation from the surface vents, the colonists would suffocate in days. It would look like a natural cave collapse. No evidence, no blame. When the shaking stopped, Danny was lying on the floor of a collapsed tunnel, with Lyra crouched over him. He had taken a piece of falling rock to the ribs during the final sprint into the caves, and every breath felt like someone was pushing a knife between his bones. Lyra had torn open his shirt and was working by the dim blue light of a chemical glow stick, her hands moving fast and steady. 2 broken ribs, she said. Maybe 3. No punctured lung, which is the only lucky thing that's happened today. Feels lucky, Danny said through his teeth. She wrapped his chest with bandages from her bag and injected him with a painkiller that took the edge off but didn't remove it entirely. He sat up against the tunnel wall and looked at the collapsed rock that now sealed the entrance behind them. How bad? He asked. Every entrance I know about is blocked. Lyra checked her communicator. Internal comms are still working. Meg has everyone in the deep chamber. Air recyclers are running, but they weren't designed for 3,000 people in a sealed space. She estimates we have maybe 3 days before the air gets too thin. Danny closed his eyes. 3 days, 3,000 people, no way out. Radio, he said. Can we get a signal through the rock? Not from down here, but there's an old mining relay antenna in the upper tunnels. If the tunnel between here and there isn't completely collapsed, I might be able to reach it and send a burst transmission. Do it. Lyra looked at him. You need to rest. I'll rest when everyone's out. Go. She went. It took her 2 hours to crawl through a partially collapsed passage, barely wide enough for her shoulders, cutting through debris with a hand torch to reach the relay antenna. She wired her communicator into it and sent a transmission on every open frequency she could reach. Her voice was calm and clear and steady, the voice of a combat medic giving a report, because that was how she kept herself from falling apart. She reported everything. The Korath deal with Salus, the attack on Greyhaven, the orbital bombardment of a civilian colony. 3,000 people buried alive. She gave coordinates, she gave names, she gave the contents of the data chip. And then she said something that was not in any military report format she had ever been taught. We are humans, she said. We did not start this fight. We tried to warn people. Nobody listened. We fought anyway, because that is what we do. Now we are dying underground, and the people who did this to us are sitting in orbit, waiting for us to run out of air. If anyone out there can hear this, we are asking for help. Not because we deserve it more than anyone else, but because 3,000 people should not die in the dark for the crime of telling the truth. The transmission went out into space at the speed of light, bouncing off relay stations and communication satellites, spreading across the void like a ripple on water. On the ocean world of Colados, Ambassador Kellery received the signal. Kellery was a Thalwen elder, a being the size of a small building, shaped something like a whale, with bioluminescent patterns running along a body that was ancient beyond human understanding. The Thalwen communicated through deep harmonic vibrations, sounds that could travel through water for thousands of miles, translated by technology into words that other species could understand. Nora Sharp had reached Pilatos 12 hours earlier on a transport she had called in from an old contact. She stood on a floating platform above Kellery's deep ocean chamber, speaking down into the water. "You heard it," Nora said. Kellery's translated voice was deep and slow, like the sound of tides moving through a cave. "I heard it. A human voice asking for help. This is not the first time humans have asked the galaxy for help. No, but it might be the last time if nobody answers. The Thalwen do not interfere in the affairs of other species. We learned long ago that intervention creates more conflict." Nora leaned on her cane and looked down into the dark water, where Kellery's massive shape moved like a shadow beneath the waves. "Ambassador, I have spent my whole life being polite to people who watched others suffer and called it wisdom. I'm too old for that now. If you know something terrible is happening and you do nothing, you are not neutral. You are complicit. Those are the only two options." Kellery was silent for a long time. The water in the chamber moved with slow, deep currents that reflected the bioluminescent light on the walls. Then Kellery spoke, not to Nora, to the Galactic Council, directly, a thing that had not happened in 300 years. On Thessera, the neutral world where the Galactic Council held its sessions, the transmission arrived in the middle of a routine debate about shipping tariffs. Kellery's harmonic signal cut through every speaker in the chamber, deep and resonant, and behind it came Lyra's voice, playing for every diplomat, ambassador, and counselor in the room. The chamber erupted. Species shouted over each other. The Dramari representatives demanded the transmission be cut, calling it human manipulation. 3 smaller species that bordered Korath territory demanded an immediate investigation. Others sat in stunned silence. On Thessera, a human journalist named Katie Greer had been living and working for 2 years, documenting the growing anti-human sentiment across the galaxy. She had contacts in every diplomatic mission on the planet. Within an hour of the council session, she had obtained a copy of the original data chip contents from one of Nora's intelligence contacts. Katie didn't hesitate. She broadcasted on every open channel available: news networks, diplomatic frequencies, commercial bands, emergency channels. The full text of the Korath deal with Salus, the sensor network access, the military staging plans, all of it, unedited, unfiltered, undeniable. The galaxy saw what the Korath had done. And more importantly, they saw what had been done to the people who tried to stop it. Commander Zale, watching from his flagship above Greyhaven, received reports of the broadcast with the cold understanding that his quiet operation was no longer quiet. He didn't panic. He accelerated. He ordered his full fleet to advance on 3 neutral systems simultaneously. If he couldn't win in the shadows, he would win in the open. Back on Thessera, Councillor Dren sat in his chamber alone. He was a Velhari, Torik's uncle, and he had spent his entire political career arguing that humans were dangerous, that their involvement in galactic affairs brought nothing but destruction. He had the data to prove it. 6 incidents, 6 catastrophes, human fingerprints on every one. But now he sat with Lyra's transmission playing on a loop in his mind. We did not start this fight. We tried to warn people. Nobody listened. He thought about every one of those 6 incidents, and for the first time, he asked himself a question he had never asked before. What would have happened if the humans hadn't acted? What would the galaxy look like if Jack Dunn hadn't stopped the Velhari bombardment? If Carla Morrow hadn't destroyed the hyperspace weapon? If every human who ever stood up and said, "This is wrong," had instead done the rational thing and looked away? The answer frightened him more than any human ever had. Dren stood before the Galactic Council the next morning. He was tall, and his scales caught the chamber light, and his voice carried to every corner of the room. "I have spent my career telling this council that humans are cursed," he said. "That where they walk, war follows. I was wrong. War was already there. It was always there. The humans were simply the only ones who refused to pretend it wasn't. We called them cursed because their courage made our cowardice obvious. I am done being a coward." He proposed a coalition response, a fleet to confront the Korath at Greyhaven. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, a Velhari spoke in defense of humans. The vote was not unanimous. It was not even close. But it passed. That cursed human. Part 5. That cursed human. Deep underground, the air was getting thin. Danny could feel it. Every breath took a little more effort than the last. The colonists sat in the deep chamber in near darkness, conserving power, conserving oxygen, conserving everything. Children slept against their parents. Old people leaned against the stone walls with their eyes closed. Nobody spoke much. There wasn't enough air to waste on words. Meg Hewitt moved through the chamber like a quiet machine, checking air recyclers, distributing the last of the water rations, counting heads. She had not slept in 2 days. When Hank Russo told her she needed to rest, she looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and said she would rest when everyone was safe. He stopped asking. Danny sat against a wall with Lyra beside him. His ribs ached with every breath, and his head felt heavy and slow from the thinning air. Lyra checked his bandages and his pulse, and didn't say what they both already knew, that they had maybe 18 hours of breathable air left. "Tell me something," Lyra said quietly. "Why did you really disobey that order 5 years ago? The official story says you heard civilians on the radio, but you could have reported it and let someone else handle it." Danny was quiet for a while. The darkness around them was thick and close, and it made honesty easier somehow. "There was a girl on the transport," he said. "Couldn't have been more than 8 or 9. She got on the radio somehow. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying. She just said very calmly, 'Is anyone coming?' That's all she said. 'Is anyone coming?'" He paused. "I couldn't fly away from that. I just couldn't. My hands wouldn't let me turn the ship." "Do you regret it?" "They took my rank, and my career, and my pension. I fly a garbage freighter through the worst systems in the galaxy, for pay that barely covers fuel." He looked at her in the dim light. "I have never regretted it. Not once. Not for a single second." Lyra didn't say anything. She just leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat together in the dark and waited. Above them, space was getting crowded. The coalition fleet arrived at Greyhaven in pieces. It was not the Grand Armada that stories would later make it out to be. Most species sent 1 or 2 ships, token gestures meant to say, "We showed up," without actually risking much. The Velhari sent a light cruiser, the Renni sent a medical frigate. 3 smaller species sent scout ships that were older than some of their crew members. But the Thalwyn sent their Leviathans. 3 deep space vessels emerged from hyperspace above Greyhaven, and every sensor on every ship in the system screamed. The Thalwyn Leviathans were enormous, each one nearly 2 miles long, built from organic and metallic materials that had been grown as much as constructed. They looked like living things, dark and massive and ancient, with bioluminescent patterns running along their hulls that pulsed with slow, steady rhythms like heartbeats. They had not left Thalwyn space in over 300 years. Their arrival was not just military. It was a statement. The galaxy understood what it meant. The Thalwyn had chosen a side. Commander Zale stood on his bridge and watched the tactical display update with the new arrivals. His black eyes moved from ship to ship, calculating firepower, range, shield capacity. He was a strategist, not a gambler. The Korath fleet was strong, but the Thalwyn Leviathans were an unknown. No living Korath officer had ever seen one in combat. "Open a channel to the Coalition fleet," Zael ordered. The Coalition's communications were managed by the Thalwyn flagship, and it was Ambassador Kalori's translated voice that answered. "Commander Zael," Kalori said, each word slow and heavy like a stone dropped into still water. "You have attacked a civilian colony. You have buried 3,000 people alive. The Galactic Council demands your immediate withdrawal from this system." Zael kept his voice level. "The humans on that planet stole classified military intelligence and attacked Dominion personnel. Our response was proportional. Your response was to bombard unarmed civilians from orbit. That is not proportional. That is extermination." Zael calculated. He could fight. His fleet had the numbers. But the Thalwyn Leviathans were enormous, and their capabilities were largely unknown, and the political cost of engaging a coalition fleet that included half a dozen species would be catastrophic. The Korath Dominion was powerful, but it was not powerful enough to fight the entire galaxy at once. "I am prepared to negotiate," Zael said. "Full withdrawal, in exchange for amnesty and the return of the stolen data." Before Kalori could respond, another voice cut into the channel. It was weak and raspy and interrupted by coughing, but it was unmistakable. "This is Danny Kowalski." Lyra had managed to reconnect the mining relay antenna to the Coalition's communication frequency. Danny was speaking from underground, every word costing him precious air. 3,000 people are buried down here. 17 are already dead. 2 of them were children. Your soldiers killed them, and your ships buried the rest of us. There is no deal. There is no negotiation. Not until every single person in these caves is dug out and safe. That is not a request. There was silence on the channel. Then Kalori spoke. "We agree with the human. No negotiation until the civilians are rescued." Zael stared at the tactical display for a long time. Then he gave the order to withdraw. His fleet turned and moved away from Greyhaven, disappearing into hyperspace one ship at a time. The last to leave was Zael's flagship. Before it jumped, Zael looked at the planet on his view screen, that cold, gray, worthless rock, and he thought about how much trouble one small world full of stubborn humans had cost him. He would not forget. The rescue took 3 days. Coalition engineers and Thalwyn heavy equipment worked around the clock to dig through the collapsed canyon entrances. They cut through thousands of tons of rock and debris, meter by meter, while underground the colonists rationed their last hours of air and waited. Danny passed out from oxygen deprivation on the 2nd day. Lyra kept him breathing with a portable oxygen concentrator she had built from parts of 3 broken air recyclers. It wasn't elegant. It made a terrible grinding noise, and it smelled like burned metal. But it worked. On the morning of the 3rd day, light broke through the last wall of rubble, and fresh air rushed into the caves like a wave. The colonists walked out into the gray daylight, blinking and stumbling and holding each other. Some of them cried. Most of them just stood there and breathed. Hank Russo was part of the team that carried out the dead. 17 bodies. He carried one himself, a woman named Claire, who had worked in the colony's greenhouse. She had been standing near a tunnel entrance when it collapsed. Hank carried her out into the light and laid her on the ground gently, and then walked away and sat on a rock and didn't speak for a full day. Danny came out on a stretcher, still only half conscious. Lyra walked beside him. When the fresh air hit his face, he opened his eyes and saw the sky for the first time in 3 days, gray and cold, and the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Above them, the Thalwyn Leviathans hung in orbit, like guardian angels made of metal and light. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Council formally condemned the Korath Dominion. High Coordinator Salis was removed from her position and arrested. The secret deal was voided. New protections were established for neutral territories, with enforcement mechanisms that actually had teeth for the first time in galactic history. Councillor Dren pushed through a resolution recognizing Greyhaven's colonists for their courage. It passed, with only the Dramari voting against. But on Greyhaven itself, there was no celebration. Danny sat on a flat rock, outside what had been the main settlement. It was rubble now, broken stone and twisted metal and ash. The wind blew through it, and carried the smell of dust and endings. Lyra sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Was it worth it?" she asked. Danny looked at the ruins. He thought about the 17 people who were dead. He thought about the children. He thought about Claire from the greenhouse, and the look on Hank's face when he carried her out. "I don't know," he said. 17 people are dead, because I couldn't leave things alone." Lyra was quiet for a moment. "Thousands are alive for the same reason." He didn't answer. Some equations didn't balance. He just sat there and looked at the wreckage, and let the wind pull at his jacket. Ambassador Kellery visited Greyhaven before the Thalwen fleet departed. The ancient being observed the colony through remote sensors, and spoke to Danny via a translator unit mounted on a floating platform. "Your people are already rebuilding," Kellery said, a note of something like wonder in the translated voice. "The fires have barely cooled, and they are laying new foundations." Danny looked over his shoulder. It was true. Colonists were hauling stone, clearing debris, marking out new building lines. Meg Hewitt was in the middle of it, with a blueprint in one hand and a hammer in the other, shouting instructions that echoed off the canyon walls. "How do you do it?" Kellery asked. "How do humans continue after everything?" Danny shrugged. "We don't really have a choice. Giving up was never something we were good at." Kellery made a low harmonic sound that the translator rendered as something between a laugh and a sigh. Then the Thalwyn Elder departed, and the Leviathans climbed away from Greyhaven's orbit, their bioluminescent hulls glowing faintly against the stars. Torek sent a message from Horizon's Edge. It arrived on Danny's communicator 3 days later, short and simple. "You are still cursed. But I am starting to think the galaxy needs cursed people." 6 months passed. Greyhaven was different now. Bigger, stronger. Ships came from across the galaxy, carrying supplies and building materials, and surprisingly, settlers. Not just humans. Velhari engineers arrived to help reinforce the canyon structures. Rennie botanists came to improve the colony's farming. A small group of Thalwyn researchers set up an ocean monitoring station in a lake at the base of the canyon, the first Thalwyn outpost on a non-Thalwyn world in centuries. For the first time in its history, Greyhaven was not just a human settlement. It was something new, something the galaxy had never seen before. Danny had a new ship. The Thalwyn had donated it, a freighter twice the size of the Rust Bucket, sleek and solid and fast. He named it the Second Chance. Lyra stayed on Greyhaven. She ran the colony's first real medical center, a proper building with proper equipment, and a staff of 12, including 3 alien medics who had volunteered to work alongside humans. Meg Hewitt became the colony's chief engineer, overseeing the reconstruction with the same fierce energy she had used to defend it. Governor Callahan, for the first time in 20 years, smiled in public. Hank Russo enlisted in the newly formed Greyhaven Defense Force. He was still young and still scared sometimes, but he showed up every day and he did his job, and nobody asked more of him than that. On the day Danny left for his first cargo run in the Second Chance, he stood on the landing pad and looked out at the colony. He saw human and alien workers side by side in the canyon, building walls and planting crops, and arguing about construction plans in 3 different languages. He saw children running between the buildings, some human, some not. He saw the alien ships in orbit, no longer strange or threatening, but simply part of the landscape. Lyra came to see him off. She stood at the bottom of the boarding ramp with her arms crossed, and that steady look in her eyes. "Come back in one piece," she said. "I'll try." "You always try, that's the problem." He smiled. She almost smiled back. Then he walked up the ramp and settled into the pilot's seat of a ship that didn't rattle or groan or catch fire, which was a strange and wonderful feeling. He powered up the engines and lifted off from the pad. The Second Chance climbed through Greyhaven's gray sky, smooth and sure, and broke through the clouds into the black. Danny looked back at the planet falling away beneath him, that cold, rocky, stubborn little world that had nearly killed him and then refused to let him go. He thought about Torek's message. He thought about Kalori's question. He thought about a little girl on a transport 5 years ago, asking if anyone was coming. He turned the ship toward the stars and said quietly, to no one in particular, "Still cursed." And somewhere behind him, a galaxy that had spent a century fearing humans was just beginning to understand that maybe, just maybe, being cursed was exactly what the universe needed. That Cursed Human, Part 1, The Unwanted Passenger. Danny Kowalski had been flying cargo across the galaxy for 5 years, and in all that time, he had learned one important rule. Keep your head down, make your deliveries, and never get involved in anything that wasn't your business. It was a good rule. It had kept him alive, and he was about to break it. His freighter, a rust bucket, groaned as it docked at Horizon's Edge, the largest trade station in the neutral territories. The station was a massive ring of metal and glass, spinning slowly in the dark between 3 star systems. Thousands of aliens from dozens of species lived and worked there, buying and selling and scheming and lying, all in the name of commerce. The food was cheap, the fuel was cheaper, and nobody asked too many questions about a human with a dishonorable discharge on his record. He walked through the docking bay with his hands in his jacket pockets, his boots heavy on the metal floor. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders and rough in the face, with dark hair that he cut himself and never cut well. He looked like the kind of person who had been in too many fights and lost just enough of them to stop caring about winning. The first thing he noticed was the ships. There were Korath warships sitting in the outer docking rings, 6 of them, painted black with red markings along the hulls. The Korath Dominion was an empire that had been swallowing smaller species and their worlds for decades. They were not the kind of visitors a neutral station usually welcomed. Danny stopped walking and stared at the warships through a viewport. A Velhari trade officer named Torek stepped up beside him. Torek was 7 feet tall, with green and gold scales and 4 arms, 2 of which were folded behind his back. He looked at Danny the way most aliens looked at humans, with a mixture of caution and quiet dread. "You should leave, human," Torek said. His voice was deep, and it rumbled in his chest like stones grinding together. "Whatever you are thinking, stop thinking it." "I'm thinking those are Korath warships on a neutral station," Danny said. "And that is not your problem." "Didn't say it was. Your kind never says it is, and then somehow it always becomes your problem anyway." Torek shook his massive head. "There is a saying among my people, where a human walks, war follows. I do not wish for war on this station." Danny almost smiled. "Almost. I'm just here for supplies, Torek." The Velhari did not look convinced. He walked away with heavy footsteps that shook the floor panels. Danny went to the cantina on the lower level, a dark and noisy place that smelled like engine grease and alien cooking. He ordered something that was probably food and sat in a corner booth where he could watch the door. Old habits. That was when Lyra Voss sat down across from him. She was younger than him by a few years, with short brown hair and steady eyes that looked like they had seen things most people would rather forget. She wore a worn-out medic's jacket with the United Earth Fleet insignia torn off the shoulder, and she carried a bag that clinked with medical instruments when she set it on the table. "Danny Kowalski," she said. It wasn't a question. "Do I know you?" "No, but I know you. Former Earth Fleet pilot, discharged for disobeying a direct order during the Kalan border skirmish." She paused. "You were told to abandon a civilian transport under fire. You didn't." Danny's face didn't change. "That's old news. I need passage to the outer colonies. I can pay." "Find another ship." "There are no other ships. The Koran are locking down departures in 6 hours. I intercepted one of their coded transmissions." Lyra leaned forward and lowered her voice. "They're planning to use this station as a staging ground. Full military operation. They've cut a deal with the station's high coordinator. Free passage through neutral space in exchange for access to the station's long-range sensor network." Danny stared at her. "That would give them eyes on half the galaxy. Now you understand why I need to leave." He sat back and rubbed his face with both hands. He could feel the old familiar pull, the one that always got him into trouble, the voice in his head that said, "This is wrong, and somebody has to do something about it." It had cost him his career, his rank, and nearly his life. "If what you're saying is true, leaving isn't enough," he said quietly. "I know." Before either of them could say more, a sharp tone sounded through the cantina speakers. A message for Danny, summoning him to the office of High Coordinator Salus. Salus was a Dramari, an insectoid alien with a thin body covered in dark chitin and large compound eyes that reflected the light in her office like black mirrors. She sat behind a wide desk and regarded Danny with an expression that might have been contempt or might have been fear. With Dramari, it was hard to tell. "Your docking privileges have been revoked," she said. Her voice clicked and buzzed between words. "All human vessels are to depart within 12 hours. "Why?" Danny asked. "Security concerns." "What kind of security concerns?" "The kind that are not your concern." Salus folded her thin hands on the desk. "Leave quietly, Danny Kowalski. That is my strong advice." Danny looked at her for a long moment. He could see it in the way her fingers twitched, the way her eyes kept darting to the door. She was afraid. Not of him, of something much bitter. He left her office without another word and found Lyra waiting in the corridor. "She's in on it," Danny said. "I know. I scanned her communications while you were inside. The full agreement is on the station's restricted network." "Can you get it?" Lyra held up a data chip and smiled for the first time. "Already did." They moved fast after that. The docking bays were already filling with Korath soldiers in black armor, checking identification and sealing exits. Danny and Lyra took a maintenance corridor that wound through the station's guts, past humming generators and leaking pipes, until they reached the bay where the rust bucket was parked. Danny didn't slow down. He walked straight at them with his hands raised like he was surrendering. And when the first one reached for his weapon, Danny grabbed his wrist, twisted hard, and slammed him into his partner. Both went down. It wasn't graceful. It wasn't heroic. It was fast and ugly, and it worked. They ran up the boarding ramp, and Danny threw himself into the pilot's seat. The rust bucket's engines coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, with a sound like an old man clearing his throat. The ship lurched off the docking clamps and shot forward through the bay doors just as they began to close. Alarms screamed behind them. Weapons fire streaked past the cockpit, close enough to light up the glass. Danny flew like he always flew. Too fast, too close, and just barely in control. He threaded the rust bucket between two Korath warships before they could lock weapons. And then they were out, burning hard into open space. Lyra sat in the co-pilot's seat, breathing hard, clutching the data chip in her fist. "Well," Danny said, his hands still shaking on the controls. "So much for keeping my head down." Behind them, Horizon's Edge grew smaller in the rear viewport, its lights fading into the black. Ahead of them was nothing but empty space, and a galaxy that didn't want their help. they were going to help anyway.